I come from a place of kind of a unique blend of marriage within my academics. I have a bachelor's in police science, and I have a master's in psychology and counseling. And so I knew that there had to be a marriage between law and psychology at some point in time. I wasn't sure, but I followed my passion, and it seemed to work well, particularly with where I was called. So let's kind of begin, and I'm going to share my screen. So forgive me if this all is going to, I mumble through and everything else here. And I'm going to reduce me a little bit, and we're going to try to understand what this is all about. Okay. All right. So far, so good. All right. So I come from trying to help people understand the motivations and the psychological development, because I think it's very important for those that we serve to break away from the myths that have been readily given, not only by our society, but by the offenders themselves. And the offenders are very astute at the mythologies and the falsehoods that get spread about these kind of crimes and behaviors, and they use them readily. So today I'm going to kind of walk us through what this intersection looks like so that you can walk others through it as well. Now, when you look at stalking and you look at sexual violence, it really, any kind of crime in and of itself, there is the need for access. And I speak because I've studied so much of the criminal behavior. I speak from that premise. So we can see the lens, through the lens of that particular offender. So when I talk about stalking and sexual violence, I'm talking about not one action, I'm talking about a series of actions that are interconnected. They're woven together. It's like we have studied over and over and over again, and continue to study, why violence and sexuality intertwine so readily for many of these offenders, and we have our theories, and we have our studies, but what offenders have really told me is that they really only need two things, particularly a rapist. They only need two things to conduct their behavior, and they need accessibility and they need vulnerability. And that is critical, folks, because we have, none of us, well, except in time of COVID, are immune from accessibility. We have daily lives, we have comings and goings, we have jobs, we have responsibilities and demands. We even have to fit in going to the bank to get, money for the next day, for lunch money or whatever it may be, at various times of the night even. And offenders know this about us because they study, they watch. And so it's not one snapshot that we're introducing to what the behavior looks like. It's a series, it's an album that is presented, and they keep track. Now, why is stalking and sexual violence both? We understand a criminal justice, that's pretty self-explanatory. But why is it a public health concern, folks? And I think that's where we have to really look at, in the sense of, how this extends, the impact of this, and it is wide, it's pervasive, and it's ongoing. And even if, depending on the connection, because the next one is very clear, we know most of society still has the mythology that rapist is that person hiding behind the bushes and, jumping out and knocking you on the head. It is that person, but it's not primarily that person. And the primary rapist, or probably the majority of our rapists, know their victim. They know them pretty well. And with the aid of stalking, they know them really well. And that is the gathering of information. They're great, stalkers are great data collectors. And they spend a whole lot of time collecting data on their, and I'll call it for what it is, and how they refer to it is targets. They look for their target and then they concentrate on that target. Now, if other people fall into that target zone, they're possibly a better option, because again, it's as an offender looks, they're going to look for opportunity. They look for the best risk. Mm-hmm. And that's what we've got to look at, in a sense, that what is the best risk that is determined by these offenders. So what they both cherish is control and power. You know, with the rapist, there's the added goal. And so, but they both require research, which is the data collection, and they both require the planning. Rapes, you know, just don't happen. You just don't, it just, that thought of sexually violating someone just doesn't pop into your head one day and it seems like a good day to do it. It doesn't happen, folks. What happens is well, let me explain further. Well, you have to look at the context of stalking and rape. And the first thing we should ask ourselves is, what is the goal of this behavior? Whatever the behavior is, because there is a goal. And when you're looking at a rapist, sex offender, you're looking at a fantasy-based behavior. And they conjure up a huge fantasy of the outcome and how that will develop. And there's different categories of offender. They call them typologies, they call them categories, depending on your studies and depending on who's reporting it. But the goal is very, very similar. And so when we look at the rapist, it's the fulfillment of that sexual fantasy. But with a rapist, it's the fulfillment of the promise, particularly a predatory rapist. It's the fulfillment of the sexual assault. Now, you may think that as a rapist, that would be the goal. But for most rapists, it is the hunt. For most stalkers, if you're a predatory stalker, you're using the stalking behavior for the goal of the assault. Okay? Now, we'll get into this more, because again, I'm helping you, and I'm wanting you to see what's inside of the head of this offender. So, and forgive me because I know this is harsh to read, harsh to imagine, harsh to see, and many of you are extremely versed in hearing harsh and disturbing. My apologies, but the best way I know how to explain this type of behavior is to be very clear and transparent with that. When you look at predatory stalking, it really is the planning and the research and the data collection that they are invested in the stalking behavior. But their real goal is the accomplishment of the assault. So how this is formulated, again, is through the violent sexual fantasies that are engaged at that point when they are researching, collecting the data on their target, and then they are planning, and they rehearse this in their mind over and over. But how they gather it, you know, is the next step in that, because then they have to actually follow or surveil or engage their target somehow, some way. So they have to prepare for this. So as you can see, this is not something that happens just on a whim and a thought. This is something that's very premeditated. And I think that's what our survivors have to understand, is that it was nothing that they did. It was along the way that caused this. It was because they fell into a target zone. And at that point, they became accessible to the person, and they became vulnerable because many times they didn't know who they were engaging. And the premise probably presented to them in order to gain access was someone who was helpful, someone who cared, someone who was protective. It all came under a mask. Okay. Now I show you this example because this came from a stalking case of mine, and it actually came from a domestic violence case that also contained sexual violence in the relationship. KP is a victim. She was actually a university student, a PhD university student, and she attended UNC and came to me while I was there at Chapel Police and sought a better understanding of what was happening to her, because she was now being re-engaged by her abuser, whom she fled. The abuser was from Colorado, and she now lived in North Carolina. But she fled this relationship. It started off with very non-threatening type of contact, but then it developed, and it was hidden in certain things. Cards, like I miss you, birthday cards sent. Now think about this, folks. The mask of this in regards to sending a birthday card. How threatening can that be? You know, when you send a card and you're wishing all the best, but there was a contained message that for most, if they didn't understand the bigger picture of this, would not have understood what was happening. And so by the sending of that card, it meant, I know where you're at. I know where you're at. And it would begin this toying back and forth. And then he found her university email, and then he found her regular email and began sending more and more contacts to her, to the point where it got very specific because his data research was very good. And he finally said, you know, I'm coming to visit. And giving these benign, so it wasn't direct threats, but you had to understand the context. And context is very, very, very important, folks. Not only for our victim survivor to understand how this was not just a one snapshot, not one email or a card. It is the whole album of how this developed and what this meant. What is the underlying goal of sending this card to somebody who had to flee a situation? What's the underlying goal of sending a birthday card to someone who had to flee a situation? It was basically toying with you. And again, it's that stalking type of behavior that, as you know, Dr. Johnston said in the quote above, it's actually a foreplay. It's the toying, it's the playing. That's where the offender gets their excitement from. Imagining when you open the card and seeing who it's from, imagining your face, your breath, everything they can think of in order to make this alive for them, because they're not there. So they have to really endeavor to fantasize what the imagined outcome will be, and they're good at it. So as you can see, it's a very simple email. Where am I? And he would send photos Well, this particular offender eventually did come to North Carolina and tried to find KP. And the fortunate part is that KP and I and the university all were in contact, and so was all the resources that were supporting her through this. And it became, as you can see, a very much a needed team approach to this. One discipline cannot manage alone. Not solely advocates, not solely law enforcement, not solely whomever. University, it has to be a very collaborative venture to assist ongoing and highly lethal situations. So let's look at it a little bit more. You know, we can't, I mean, this is where I shall always remain a student, because this behavior changes all the time and we learn more and more. My teachers were the offenders. They were my best teachers. Yes, I had my academics. Yes, I had my theories. Yes, I had experiences with survivors, but who taught me about how they conducted this behavior and why were those offenders? So our research shows that there is a definitive connection between stalking and sexual assault, between stalking and domestic violence. You will see this connection. And when we look at the connection, we have to take into account the pre-assault behavior and the post-assault behavior. You can't separate one or the other, because in understanding how this is developing over a period of time gives you an understanding of, number one, how far this will extend itself. But as a post-assault, you must continue to look at your safety planning with this person, because it just doesn't stop, particularly if the connection has a very known factor between an offender and a victim. And the known part is they know each other and the data is still there without change. What we do know about rapists is that they engage in surveillance, information gathering, voyeurism. I would teach officers about the essential need to really focus on misdemeanor offenses. Because, and misdemeanor offenses, you know, are those offenses that most people think, oh, well, a peeping. Yeah, the guy's peeping. Or the obscene phone call. Or, you know, somebody rubbed up against another person in a public area. But that is purposeful. And these stalkers and these rapists have to practice. They practice. And the studies further show us that they pick their victims based upon what? Accessibility, vulnerability. And when you're looking at a stalker, it's actually conducting a threat without words. It's presence. And just the presence of the card, the presence of the message that was sent, that only that victim and offender really understands the context, until you're able to help them articulate to resources that can help further understand and actually, you know, create a plan of intervention. So, without going into extreme detail about the legality and the definitions of this, I think we have to function by and helping our victims understand that, you know, even when you go to law enforcement or even when you go to the criminal justice system, they have parameters and unfortunately they have limits. And the wording in the legal language is very specific. And so let's look at just the stalking language. And this is just an excerpt, folks. The stalking statute, as you can see, you know, is listed here, is very lengthy. And but the focus of it is that you must meet elements of that crime, but it must show before it's even considered that there is a willful and without legal purpose. And that's really, really quite important, because without legal purpose really requires a person to understand that if I show up as an offender at your favorite grocery store on the days that you routinely go to, and routinely go because it's after work or at lunch or whenever you routinely go, and I've targeted you, and you see me there time and time again, that is, you know, I can always defend that as an offender, as, you know, it's a public area, it's a store. I happen to have the same opportunities to go to and shop. Ironically, we run into each other. So showing that even though it's repetitive, and it may be a sense of that I'm getting closer and closer and closer, which is disconcerting to you and uncomfortable to you, you have to show that, number one, I fully understand with intent to create that discomfort and possibly rise it to the level of harassment, rise it to the level of following you or directly coming in contact with you, or even going to a friend of yours or a family member of yours with intent to find out about you or to get closer to you, then these are distinctive elements of the crime that have to be shown in the crime of stalking. So as you can see, it has to be willful, it has to be you, it has to be without legal purpose, it has to be repetitive, or you must show that there is a developing course of conduct, a developing pattern of behavior, right? That has directly or indirectly or by a third party been directed for the goal of acquiring access to you. And so that's a lot to ask victims, but there's a way to condense this, folks. There is a way to condense it. As you can see with sexual violence or assault, you know, and we have different levels and degrees of sexual assaults, sexual violent crimes. We have misdemeanors, we have felonies, we have different degrees of felonies. It's a little bit more involved, because what we have to also show is by force and against the will of the other person, or that the other person lacks the ability mentally or physically to really know what's happening to them or even to defend themselves. And again, the defendant knows or reasonably should know of that incapacity. So there's also elements that have to be achieved in the charging of these particular types of crimes. And each degree or each type of crime, whether they're a misdemeanor or a felony, have different elements and explanations involved with them. So it's a lot more involved when it becomes an assault. The stalking itself has a misdemeanor level to it. However, if there is a court order in effect, and the stalking, and the court order orders that person refrain from that stalking, harassing behavior, then that misdemeanor stalking charge can be actually elevated, and a felony stalking can be again charged. So there are some avenues for that, and there are some reasons that court orders are, even though we may think that they're not going to do anything, they allow us a gateway into enhancing the charge of stalking and the behavior of stalking. But again, it requires that that person has been ordered, the offender has been ordered to not conduct that type of behavior with this particular victim. So there's lots of things that we have to understand legally about both of these arenas to combine them, or to show that one, the stalking behavior was involved in the end result of an assault. Okay, I hope I'm getting this, because you know, I hope we're following. And please, you know, hold on to your questions or your thoughts or your comments, and we can further look at them as I finish up with this, because I certainly want you to be able to understand as best as I can explain the criticalness of what we have to do in order to teach our victims how best to help themselves. So, as I mentioned, you know, we have had for many, 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 many years. I began my endeavors, you know, within the law enforcement realm, but at some point I had to understand why. I just didn't understand why people intentionally go out to hurt other people, and I needed to understand that. And so I spent an enormous amount of time studying offender behavior. Before I came to North Carolina, I actually separated myself from law enforcement and really focused on the mental health component of this. And it is, if there's, let me tell you, any tolerance and patience and understanding, it's those providers who work with offenders. Because what I found in really concentrating on offender behavior is that there is a denial wall for every kind of behavior that you can think of. Because for these offenders to actually own what they have done and the impact and the injury and the violence, it's really, really difficult for them. And most of them don't have the ego strength to be able to conduct that kind of self-assessment or ownership. And so in treatment, it's a long endeavored and has to be ongoing process. 28 weeks, you know, for most offenders, doesn't even cover surface. It may cause them to assess their own behavior, but to actually change the behavior is an ongoing process. It's equivalent to almost an addiction, folks. And so it just doesn't go away once that they're discovered, or it has to be accountable, and it has to be ongoing as far as treatment and accountability. FBI provided us with a lot of typologies initially. Incredible researchers decided that, you know, typologies come and go, but categories and commonalities were starting to be revealed through research. You know, Nicholas Groth years and years and years ago became a pioneer for, you know, sex offenders and understanding those kind of categories. Predke and Knight became really involved not only with sex offenders, but also stalking type of behaviors. And so these incredible researchers brought to light and continue to bring to light a better understanding of the type of classifications that we may apply to better understand offender categories. And so what I've given you is kind of this kind of circle of behavior, because it does, one requires the other to complete it. And the two categories of stalkers at the very top, you will see simple obsessional and what we call cause stalking. Can also be defined as those simple obsessional, those rejected stalkers, those individuals who have had some degree of prior relationship with their victim. And it can be very brief, or it can be years and years and years of ongoing. So you can imagine if it's years and years and years of ongoing, the amount of data that is collected throughout the years to be able to use that, because they can immediately put their victim on a pedestal, and the minute that they sense that the victim is starting to distance themselves or reject them, in their eyes, that victim comes tumbling down from the pedestal. And in that, what ends up happening is that the stalker in simple obsessional category then becomes, you know, it's very adversarial. And they now look at their victim not as this treasured possession, but as the enemy. And so we hear that with certain offenders, domestic violence, abusers, sexual, you know, repetitive sex offenders, in regards to having that connection with their victim, or other victims that may fall into that immediate rise and fall. Cause stalking is a little bit more intentional, because this is where you truly have predatory action, predatory behavior. And the goal for that predatory behavior is to produce, as we talked about, produce the sexual assault that is desired. So in cause stalking, those predatory stalkers use stalking as a means and a tool to access their victim. With that comes the different kind of rapist categories at the bottom. And that really is behavior and personality driven. And a lot, like I said, all of this is really strongly based in fantasy construction. And the same with the rapists. Your fantasies will always have an outcome that is desired and wanted, but the actual outcome that they experience is far from that, because what most rapists don't take into account is the victim's response to being violated, being subjected, being stalked, they don't take in these natural responses. They just hold on to the imagined outcome. And what you will see with these particular stalking categories is both are very lethal. Your simple obsessional, if we equate them to a lot of our domestic violence abusers, we see how lethal they can be. The cause stalking, again, contains that lethality built into it, because the goal is violence. The goal is assault. With the simple obsessional, the assault becomes kind of not the intended outcome, but becomes a reactionary outcome to what they perceive the victim is doing. Now, I hope I didn't confuse things more, but welcome to the people I spent a lot of time trying to understand. So, how does this formulate itself? And this is kind of important to take in, folks, because escalations for both type of behaviors, stalking and sexual violent type of behaviors, escalate in time, and they escalate with the confidence gained by the offender. Like I said, an offender doesn't wake up one day and decide that they're going to start stalking or start violating people, they have to build up to it, and they practice. And as you can see, if we look at the lower, the sexually violent escalations, they begin with, as you can see, almost, we used to call them, again, nuisance type of behaviors, threatening letters, emails, texts, to the point of where it started to develop into more obscene phone calls, direct, hearing the voice. Each are developing connections to their victim physically so that they can incorporate a voice to the fantasy. They can, when they move into peeping, and they can do all of these back and forth and several combined with each other. They don't always have to go up, but they have to add, because the need to create the excitement has to be based in escalation. They don't get satisfied with just making obscene phone calls. They have to develop further. So they go into peeping, they go into exhibitionism or indecent exposure. This is, and forgive me, there's a typo, it's called frottage. And that is the actual, the rubbing up against the person unbeknownst to the person, and we can see that, if you've ever been in a crowded subway, what people rubbing up against you, not intentionally, but just trying to fit, feels like, and it's uncomfortable, and it's, it just makes you just not feel safe. Well, that's the intention. And with each of these escalations, as you can see, it requires a little bit more confidence to get closer and closer and closer and closer to your victim, to the point of where you finally escalate into a rape category. And now for most rapists, they want you to know who they are, because they also want to mask it as something else. And again, those are those people who know their victim well. As you can see with the stalking escalations, that too requires movement. And so they advance themselves. They continue, they started a very, what you might conceive to be benign almost, it's like, I'm going to throw out a few texts here and there and see if you respond. I may, respond with an email or contact you by email. And if you respond, that means I've gained access to you. And with that, it begins, because if I've gained access with you, then I'm going to escalate it to repetitive contacts with you. And think about it, folks. I mean, one of the things that with stalking gets very confusing is when you have mostly young people, because we have that category of dating that is, just part of the norm. And when they start to date and then they realize that this isn't going, but one party really, really is invested in this dating process, invested in whom they want to be with, it almost becomes kind of obsessive. And in that obsessive type of behavior, they contact repeatedly. They have one opportunity, like a date, and they want to see that person the next moment. They want to go to lunch, they want to go to breakfast, they want to go to dinner, they want to go to a movie, they want to breathe your air, whatever it is, they want to be with you. And so it becomes almost suffocating for some people. And that's how they kind of describe it. It just won't stop. It won't stop. And so they may break it off. And that person who's the offender of the stalking or the repeated harassment may stop for a little bit, let things calm, and then start up again. And with that, it's a very light contact. And that light contact allows access, particularly if it's responded to. And then it's further developed and further developed and further developed. If it doesn't stop after a victim says, please stop, this was wrong, I shouldn't have recontacted with you, please do not contact me anymore. And that offender continues to contact, my encouragement to those victims is, number one, you've given your warning, do not respond. Do not continue the interaction back and forth of trying to reason and explain, because it's all about access. Okay? You know, it's kind of the same when you look at the sexual violent escalation. It's about access. And wherever opportunity has given and lent access, you're going to have attempts by these offenders to escalate that into further. The stalking can then escalate into what we call a level 3, which is site stalking. I can now start coming to your workplace. I can come to your, to your AA meeting or your church or your wherever you may be, the school, the bus, where I know that you have a routine that's dependable, has consistently shown me that that's where you go. But this is all pretty nonviolent up until the point of site stalking, and then you hit an escalating. That can be, I grab you to talk, I grab you and I force you and I say, you've got to talk to me now. I'm not leaving your house. I'm not leaving the parking lot. I'm not leaving whatever. And at that point, it's escalated itself to even very quickly a 4. And you're looking at continued escalation to the point of where if you're trying to block me and my access or even allowing me access, I'm going to continue to develop this further to the point of now I'm going to stalk you with an intended purpose of, it can be a sexual assault, it could be a murder, it could be kidnapping, it can be whatever it may be, a battering. So as you can see, all of these have intended purpose, and the intended purpose is access to my target. So helping a survivor or a victim understand the context of why these behaviors, think about it, folks, how many times we've had victims come up to us and say, why me? Why me? I'm a good person. I wasn't mean to this person. I just wanted things to stop. Very reasonable. But to an offender, particularly a stalker, there's purpose in my behavior. So we have to understand what the purpose and the goal is, because they're kind of one and the same. And so for a stalker, it may be threatened to sexually assault, that this has been going on. I can get to you anytime I want. I know your routine. They may, again, send someone else to sexually assault their victim so that they can keep their hands clean. I have to tell you, I had a husband and wife on one of my cases one time, and the wife was in her 30s and the husband had just entered his 80s. And yes, it happens. And she said, this is not working. I'm not getting what I need from it. And you're a nice person, but right. So at that point, she left the home and established herself in an apartment. He still was very much in love with her, but and then she started to experience, suspicious cars sitting out in front of her house, suspicious people following her, an attempt to break into her house, threatening messages, kind of ominous texts or voice messages left for her all started to happen. And so our natural response was, you want to go to the closest circle and then you spread out, particularly. And so I invited the husband to come and talk to me. And he comes shuffling in with the assistance of a walker, and sat before me. And as we continued to talk and talk and talk, he finally said, "Sabrina, look at me. I'm 80 years old. I go to bed at 8 o'clock at the very latest. My health is not the greatest. But I really love my wife. I really love her. She is my true possession. I hired someone to stalk her." And folks, he did. He hired a stalker. He found the person on Craigslist. Yep. And this person, the only criteria that the husband said is, do not hurt her. Do not hurt her. I just want her to what? Come back. The goal was to return to the relationship. Well, there are folks out there, folks, that seek others to carry out the assault against the victim. And it can be because of retaliation. We've all heard these horrendous stories of ads being taken out, for a good time, goes to so-and-so victim, which the victim didn't put out there, but someone else did as a retaliatory behavior. This happens. And, I know I'm speaking to the choir here, but we have to understand that this is all part of the stalking realm. And it can happen with various degrees. That's why our stalking law says directly, indirectly, or by third party. So it's inclusive. It doesn't have to be that person directly that wants that person back. It can be because I've hired someone to do it too, which both of them were charged. So how does this sexual assault prior? They engage in a variety of stalking behaviors. That escalation that I showed you with the stalking had a variety. I mean, you will see sitting out on the street, which is a public street, right? So again, the legality must be considered. There is legal purpose to be on a public street. You have legal purpose. Now, repetitively, routinely, at, close to the home, with identifying who this person is that's sitting out in that car or passing by your house over and over and over and over again, may question and bring into light the context and the purpose to disengage and challenge for lawful purpose. So there's a lot that we need to have the stalking victim do in order to identify that clearly there is another purpose for this type of behavior other than sitting out on a public road. They may actively follow the victim. They may repeatedly contact the victim in various forms. And, thanks to good old social media, there is wide area to learn more and more and more. As a stalker, I can look at utilities online. I can look at your tax records online. I can look at, whatever I want to pay 99 cents for as far as information, or $1.99. If you are intentionally my target, you're my investment now. And that is from the mindset of a stalker and eventually rapist. So I continue to learn about your habits and your daily routines. I continue to find out what your value system is all about, what you treasure, what you value as far as reputation or people or endeavors or whatever. I'm going to gather that about you, because it's either that, and that, as you can see, I want to identify your vulnerability or potential vulnerabilities. I mean, folks, you know, I have a 17-year-old boy, and you want to talk about a mama bear? I don't want anybody messing with my boy. So if you're a parent and you're experiencing all of this, guess where my vulnerability, or anybody's vulnerability for that matter, that may be a parent, it's going to be trying to identify, if I can't get to you, my identified victim, I'm going to go for those around you that are of value to you, your parents, your grandparents, your children, your dear friends, supportive friends that were once my friends, maybe, I don't know. So I cast the net wide when I'm searching for vulnerabilities. And then, or I bring you close to me by luring you and grooming you, you know? I show up at just the right times. I talk to you when you need some support. I am available to you when no one else is. It's part of that incestuous type of being a part of your world and belonging to your world, and then pushing as many of your supports out, because I want to be your soul world, because then your vulnerabilities will be certainly available to me when I am ready, when I want, when the time is right. And please understand, sex offenders, you know, the excuse of, I just couldn't help myself, you know, I couldn't stop myself. It was, or I was too drunk. And they conduct an assault. An assault requires capability. It requires capability. And when so you can't be, and it has to occur. I mean, you have to think about this. You just don't fall into the behavior. And so all of those excuses that are optimally given at various times by a sex offender or a stalker or a batterer are untrue, folks, because it requires thinking and capability and planning. It is premeditation. So let's say the stalking worked. I gained access to you. I was able to, you know, build on your vulnerabilities, access your vulnerabilities, and I conducted a sexual assault. Does the stalking stop? Usually not. Unless this was an assault that was conducted stranger to stranger. And why is that? Because you don't know me, really. I may have lured you with a lot of false pretense and a mask, basically, to get you alone and to gain access to you. So if we have the majority of our sexually violent crimes committed by someone who knows their victim, I, as that offender, need to do some things to hide the assault. So I have to kind of continue to contact repetitively. I have to continue to either manipulate or even threaten you not to report by reframing the whole incident if there was alcohol or drugs involved. And I have to determine what you've recalled, what you believe occurred, so that I can reframe it as to, and how many times have we heard this, excuse me, where the offender says, no, 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 you really liked what we were doing. And you told me it was okay. And so we continued. And your victim has no memory of any of this. So, you know, here you have a person who has insidiously gained access to your world. You've granted them a permission to be around you, and even may have bestowed them with some sense of trust. At that point, you still don't want to believe. You don't want to believe that this person deliberately and intentionally harmed you. So you may buy that reframing for a period of time, and that social contact may continue because you're still, you know, trying to remember, you're still trying to verify in your own head, you're still trying to make sense out of what has happened to you. So in many levels, your stalking continues because, and that is the post-assault behavior. You had pre-assault behavior that we just talked about before that, and now this is your post-assault behavior. And so you can see that it is ongoing, that the stalking behavior is valued and applied even after the assault occurs. So what's our goal? You know, and how do we help? Because we know that the goal for the offender is indeed this, is to continue to be a threat, and or to continue to have access. And with that, we have to kind of help our victim survivors determine what's available to them. And that is really, really important at this point, is helping them figure out interventions. And so as you can see, I try to build this on a sense of advocate world. And I think understanding what the process can be that we can do for them is real important, because we have also parameters. And as advocates, you know, certainly I come from a place of law enforcement in that regard, but I also come from a place of honoring the victim process. And so that unconditional support is really vital. You all offer that on a continuous availability. Law enforcement doesn't have that availability so readily, because of the fact that they move from case to case to case to case to case. And so, you know, as much as they would like, I would hope that law enforcement can be there and aid and answer all the questions, they may not be able to, not as fast and readily as a survivor needs. So you become that part of a very critical intervention team. Your continuous processing with them, educating, helping to explain on a very wide level, wide basis level, continues to allow them to create more informed decisions, and also to see how lethal can get or has gotten. And so, you know, the assessment piece of this, and in then feeding into a safety plan, is where I see advocates excel, you know, and this is where you are critical. Law enforcement comes from a place of immediate safety, you know, and if you have units that are truly dedicated to victim services, then you have a little bit more availability to continue to not only assess lethality, but also to provide how do I say, reviewed safety planning. So in conjunction with law enforcement or the prosecutor's office or even medical, sometimes, it's a team effect, so that when you create a safety plan, it is what's happening based upon the assessment of what has happened and what is currently happening. So it's the pre and post type of behaviors that really will determine your safety plan. The encouragement for victims to document and retain all forms of communication, it's a natural reaction for us that whenever we receive communication from someone who has hurt us, it's a natural reaction to just delete it or throw it away, but it's critical that they hold on to all forms of communication, and how they do that really, can be shared in putting it on a hard drive, separate, putting letters, notes, cards, whatever in a box. Or just continually be re-traumatized every time they open up their email and see that. What we also have to do is reassess the safety plan as behaviors begin to escalate. So that's where this lethality assessment is ongoing. Every time there's an occurrence of a behavior, it has to be on some level reassessed as to any changes that are needed or improved to the safety plan. So your safety plan is dynamic in a sense. It's not static. It has to change, and it has to be a safety plan that is shared with not only law enforcement but prosecutors, anyone who's still working with that victim, so that other plans or other suggestions don't interrupt or jeopardize the existing plan that is working. Civil options, criminal charges, all of those come into play too. And advocating while not alienating. And folks, please, I say this with all due respect. Law enforcement is under the microscope all the time. Your behaviors, and I'm not saying that that's a bad thing, trust me. But there is a sensitivity to that. And if they know that they're being judged, it has a sense of creating a disengagement from the process or from the needed advocacy. So, I think it's a mutual respect place. And teaching while you advocate are subtle art forms. And I encourage you to do that. I'm not saying that you stop advocating within the disciplines. I'm saying that please understand that law enforcement, I think, really wants to do a good job, at least I did. And so getting feedback about that job is important and crucial, but not to assume that I don't know anything about what I'm doing, or let me explain why I need to do it in the fashion that I've done it. And that's where that communication is really necessary between the two disciplines. So how do you begin? You begin to offer your victim this direction. They must begin a chronology of the relationship. I call it a map. And usually the relationship is written out, how they met, when they met, information that was shared at the time, because you're going to see all sorts of triggering and yet identifiable vulnerabilities that were accessed at that time of connection, and how that relationship developed and why you ended it. And were there other people that were well aware of what was happening, that you shared information? Because what we do know is that most victims, 94% of victims, will tell someone else about what's happening. And they may not tell law enforcement at the time, but those other people become witnesses. at the time of the occurrence. And that is really, really important, because in stalking we know when a sexual assault has occurred, but stalking is ongoing and it's insidious. And so when you have people that can add to the support and credibility of the victim's report and account, then you add strength. So have them start with this chronology, and it's really hard to do. The other thing is that for those of you, you may be aware of it, it's a stalking and assessment, harassment assessment and risk profile. It's called SHARP. And it truly was developed, and it's really for victims, and even advocates can go through and take this. It's a web-based assessment, and it you answer questions about what's happening within the experience itself. And it really is quite good, and can lend some insight for those victims that might be hesitant in recognizing that indeed the stalking is goal-oriented, and goal-oriented may be to harm you further. And of course, official police and medical reports and other documents and evidence should be retained, because when this develops, this is part of the pre-assault behavior, or even post-assault behavior if you've gone for that. But it's all viable to show that stalking was a very necessary and applied crime in this situation. The other thing is creating a stalking log. And as you can see, it's pretty simple: date and time, location, description of what happened at that particular time, the response that was given by the victim, and any witnesses. And what you see, folks, if it's accomplished, it can be on a calendar, it can be in a spiral notebook that you create this and you're just logging. That conducted by the victim, created by the victim, and applied, is admissible in court. And it lends itself, as you can see, for witnesses. In a stalking type of behavior, witnesses don't come until there's usually the propensity for now physical violence. And so when you have witnesses in a stalking situation, you really have aided the victim's report on this considerably. So, safety plan, it continues. And I urge you at this point, as we've talked about, to revisit this plan as the stalking develops. And for victims to understand that stalking was a very essential part of what has happened to them. So therefore, there may be long processing and discussions about living with stalking, and what they need to do, or if they've relocated themselves, the address confidentiality, particularly after relocation, is a real important program to link them up with, because what you're having to do is slowly erase your trail that the stalking was able to provide. And like I said, the stalking continues even after the assault. So you have to kind of continually process with your victims the next interventions that are reasonable and what they can sustain. And that includes the criminal options, and that includes the civil options that are available to them. Because I think at that point, they need to understand that the criminal options can be very taxing and demanding. And as you can see, there has to be a traceable link. That means a connection that is clearly showing of intent between the stalker and the victim. And that also can be the sex offender and the victim, the rapist. So what it means is that you have to have these conversations, which I know you do, but they have to involve what it's like to be not only a witness to a crime, but also the victim of the crime. And the justice system demands this dual role, because you are the witness, probably the only accurate witness to the crime, because the defendant is not going to be there. Remember that. So the more witnesses that you have that can verify how this developed to the end result of now a report or an arrest, you have to be able to have those conversations with your victim, because there will be an aftermath. It can be an acceleration of stalking or an acceleration of trying to assault you or even harm you further. It can be harassment to not show up. All of these factors, which then lend itself to both options or one or the other options, which is the civil option. And we know that 50B and 50Cs are only as good as their enforcement. And that not only is the law enforcement of it, but also the victim's enforcement of it, which means you know, as you can't adapt it, you can't change, even as you're being lured to talk about this again, you know, by your offender. And again, your safety plans are only as good, legal process is only as good as the victim is willing to commit to. Do they have other rights? Yes, they do. And as you've probably been aware, you know, North Carolina now in 2019 developed the Crime Victims' Rights Marcy's Law inclusion that added even more definitions in rights inclusion for those victims of stalking and communicating a threat, which, as you can see, was added to that crime victims' rights. But also, you know, if they're the valid protective order, which was always there, but then again expanded itself to, you know, other domestic violence or, you know, criminal trespass, those kind of things. So under crime victims' rights, you know, stalking has been highlighted, and along with other additional crimes, but it now is recognizing the essentialness of the benefits and rights that victims deserve as they go through the process of trying to hold this person accountable. So, woo, one more tool. And for those of you who may not have heard, which I hope you have, it is NCVAN's smartphone app. And this app can be acquired for free download. And this was designed for crime victims, folks. And it can be accessed through your Google or your Apple Play app stores. And in it, you will see, I mean, on your left, you will see an NCVAN for crime victims. That's the app. And you download that. And then it gives you a whole menu of options and resources that we're trying to build on. But it also has access to what we call an e-guide. And the e-guide is written specifically for crime victims, folks. And in language that I hope is understandable and beneficial. We had a lot of help from our state partners and a lot of help from NCVAN staff people who are just experienced, and it just makes you realize how rich our state is in resources. So please download this if you're unfamiliar with it. Encourage your victims that you're working with, because at 3 a.m. when you can't be reached or another agency is not needed at that time, and they have questions and they have concerns, or they want to understand more, or they just want to see the resources out there, this app can do it. And it is updated and continually updated every quarter. So love to hear from you in regards to your feedback about the app and about things that we can do to add and simplify, but mostly to aid those that are in need of our assistance. So I think I'm done. Yes, we did it. Thank you. Thank you. What I'm going to do, there's my email. Please let me know if I can be of service, or if questions need to be answered from that perspective. But I just kind of, if there's any last few minutes here, because I value your time and want to be respectful of that. If there's any questions after we spent this time together, any questions?